All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the seminar. Welcome to everybody online. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'll just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land here, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise their custodianship of country, as well as recognising the traditional custodians of the land from which all our people joining us online today are joining now. I'm absolutely thrilled to finally, after long planning and many years of collaborating from afar, be able to introduce in person Dave Poulton, who, although he's doing a PhD here in CBCS now, has already a long history of expertise in environmental impact assessment and offsetting law and policy, particularly working to improve the way that environmental impact assessment and biodiversity offsetting has been done in Canada. And until recently, through various different roles, so including through Director of the Alberta Land Institute, I should have mentioned where he's based, in Calgary, for those who weren't in the morning tea just now, which is a land use policy research institute. And prior to that, advocating for parks and protected areas with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. So with degrees in arts and law, not enough. He's recently embarked upon a PhD working with me and also Brian Head. And you've been in, I don't know, I was going to say hours and hours of interviews with people involved, engaged in doing environmental impact assessment in Canada, but I'm thinking it must be weeks and weeks actually in total time. And we have the opportunity to have a sneak peek of some of those early results. So thank you, Dad. You're welcome.
Thank you, Maxine. So yes, I'll be discussing the results of some of my interviews with both government officials and stakeholders that deal with them on the mitigation hierarchy. And I say when I got into this, I expected levels of discussion that were significantly more nuanced and sophisticated than the ones that I actually ended up getting into. But I'll get to that in due course. So this is the mitigation hierarchy. I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with it. It's basically a framework that prescribes a set of priorities for mitigation actions. Start by avoiding any impacts that can be avoided. Those that can't be avoided should be minimized. Where possible, on-site restoration should be used to reverse and remediate any impacts that can be done. That leaves one with the residual impact, and then the offset is calculated as a last resort, as a means of compensating for the unavoidable, unminimizable, unrestorable residual impact. The mitigation hierarchy is outlined in any number of academic publications, in professional guidance in the field of impact and environmental assessment, and in international standards documents. But it's often not really explained. And I think that that becomes a problem when people who are not familiar with it try and apply it, because they don't necessarily understand the rationale behind it. So I've attempted to put that in simplified form, that as one moves from the left side of the chart to the right, there's an increasing amount of human intervention, more room, increased risk for failure. There's declining equivalency, meaning that the outcome that you get is likely to be significantly different than the ecosystem characteristics that you started with, that you're targeting. And there's inevitably an increased time lag. And there can be, of course, management actions that can mitigate each of these. You should be careful how I say mitigate, and can lessen each of these risks, but they're all significant, and that is precisely why offsetting should be last in the hierarchy. So there's several mentions of the mitigation hierarchy in some form in Canadian legislation or in policy. The clearest, although it's still indirect, is in our Species at Risk Act, which would translate to your threatened species, I suppose. We do have discussion of mitigation options in our Impact Assessment Act, which is our new national impact assessment legislation, and our Fisheries Act, which is one of our longest standing environmental regulatory regimes. They list mitigation actions, but they don't set out any hierarchy or priority for them. We do, however, have several policy statements from different agencies within the government that lay out the hierarchy in some form in their own words. But each of these comes only from a particular agency applicable to its own work. There is no national federal policy around the mitigation hierarchy. So before looking at my interviews, I just want to talk about where things we've seen in other places, where things have gone astray. And some of the early reports of the mitigation hierarchy falling afoul came with respect to wetlands in North America. So in US wetlands, one of the reasons for the 2008 wetland mitigation rule that somebody might be familiar with was that the Environmental Protection Agency found that the US Army Corps of Engineers, that's responsible for doing wetland offsetting, was often allowing compensation to reduce the amount of impact avoidance and minimization that be required. So, in other words, either ignoring or subverting the mitigation hierarchy. Similarly, with respect to Alberta wetlands, my home province, Sherry Clare found that in her interviews with officials, there's a pronounced tendency to overlook avoidance in favor of compensation. So again, offsetting becoming the first resort rather than the last one. In France, there's a project report said that the discussion of linear infrastructure only focused on offset possibilities. There's a recent paper just came out a few weeks ago with respect to Chile that seems to find that the use of compensation measures exceed what you would expect from a proper application of the hierarchy. And here in Australia, the EPBC Act has been reviewed a couple of times, one by Megan Evans, who many of you know. Her early report on it said that the hierarchy was not understood by proponents, but was applied by regulators. Her more recent publication, I think coming from the same series of interviews, said that some of the participants reported to her that there's no appetite from the government or proponents to focus on avoidance and minimization. And in the official review by Graham Samuel in 2020, he found that proponents see offsets as something being negotiated at the outset rather than being a fulsome exploration and exhaustion of options to avoid or mitigate impacts. So we have 5 different scenarios around the world where the mitigation hierarchy seems to be on pretty shaky ground, if not being actively subverted. There have been some comments in more general applications that have tried in more general publications that have tried to generalize about that, saying basically that regulators ignore the mitigation hierarchy or the mitigation hierarchy is fundamentally weak. I think that's a very interesting thing to explore. And if I was maybe starting my career, I would love to do sort of an international comparison of that. But given the limitations that I'm under, I thought I'd really like to answer the question of, is this a problem in the Canadian federal regime? And maybe by exploring that, I might be able to uncover some of the factors that might contribute to these other situations and maybe lay the groundwork for a more general understanding of this phenomenon, if it is a general phenomenon. So the question that I started with, and this is directly from my confirmation, do federal resource regulators in Canada apply the hierarchy of environmental mitigation mitigation options in a manner consistent with policy guidance, their own policy guidance, that is, professional guidance and the academic literature, and really getting down to the more substantive environmental questions about this. Does the availability of offsetting induce regulators to lower standards around avoidance and minimization? And in the light of this, is offsetting really meeting policy goals and objectives? And does it improve environmental outcomes the way it promises? So, before I get to my findings, you have to have a bit of an understanding of Canadian federal law and the structures around environmental assessment. I'll try to keep this short and reasonably painless, but the fundamental to understand this is that the authority over the environment is deeply fragmented in the Canadian regime. At the most the highest level, the constitutional level. The division between federal powers and provincial powers is both important and not clearly defined, which means there's a lot of litigation over it, and the hesitancy, I would say, especially on the part of federal authorities, to really strongly assert authority for fear that they're going to be subject to a constitutional challenge. Then the federal government devolves powers to the territories and 3 northern territories. And within each of these, then the responsibilities are divided up among multiple departments and multiple agencies in each department. So there's no single environmental regulator. And the result is that there may be many agencies with partly complementary or partly conflicting mandates who may be wrestling with a single project or single issue. This is the process that's prescribed by our Impact Assessment Act. Martine suggested that I animate this to phase in the different parts so you wouldn't be wowed by the whole thing. I couldn't do that after several hours of trying. But where you have to, if you look up the main center of the graph here, the proponent makes a proposal to either the Canadian Energy Regulator for major energy projects, interprovincial energy projects, or for all other major designated projects, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. They then put out a notice to all federal departments. They're required to do this by their legislation. They're calling for expert input for anybody that has expertise that may be relevant to the issue. So it goes out to these different federal departments who then bring in their own experts and will report back to the Impact Assessment Agency. The Impact Assessment Agency is the primary conduit back to the proponent to answer any questions, clarify any issues. This is a back and forth iterative process. Ultimately, either the Canadian Energy Regulator or the Impact Assessment Agency, I'll just refer to this as commonly known as IAC, and that's the acronym I'll just use from now on. IAC will compile and synthesize all that advice from all the different sources of expertise, both within the government and also external stakeholders and First Nations interests. Write a decision report that recommends a decision that goes to either the Minister of Environment, the Minister of Fisheries, or both of them, and either of them can refer it to the entire federal cabinet if it's intended, if it's likely to be a major and politically dicey decision. So the process here is that we have 2 agencies at least that are primarily concerned with running the process and not with substantive expertise. And around the outside, agencies that are providing the expertise into the process. This Environment and Climate Change Canada, which is the Federal Environment Department, sort of replicates this process in miniature because they have several agencies. They have air quality, water quality, climate change, and the Canadian Wildlife Service here, which is responsible for species at risk, wetlands, migratory birds. In order to avoid sort of chaos within the department, there's this coordinating agency called the Environmental Protection Operations Division, or EPOD. And like IAC, EPOD is responsible for the flow of information and synthesizing the input from all the various parts of expertise within ECCC, sorry, Environment and Climate Change Canada. Okay, you don't need to have mastered all that, but I just wanted to emphasize we've got agencies that are primarily focused on process, and we've got agencies that are primarily focused on providing expertise, substantive expertise. Oh, okay. So what I did over the last year and a half was I undertook 36 interviews with officials in these various agencies. And I was trying to get their general approach to what they think of impact assessment, what they think the role of mitigation is, and in particular, were they aware of the mitigation hierarchy? What did they think of it? How did they apply it? Those interviews broke out the distribution of them like this. Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, I did do one interview with, and they kind of fit awkwardly into this chart. Ultimately, with them, Transport Canada, I excluded for purposes of that analysis. I'm going to hear here. They just seem to have their own particular set of issues, and they're just complicated things too much. So, what did we get out of this? Interview details. Interviews range from 54 minutes to 4 hours and 22 minutes. Done primarily over Zoom, encoded. Limitations of this method, both freely acknowledges, and it's also sort of fundamental to the interview, to this form of qualitative research, that the results are not to be taken as representative in the larger populations, to only understand what these particular people's perspective was. Perhaps we can draw some lessons from that, but it's not intended to be statistically significant. Semi-structured interviews means that they're free-ranging, and therefore answers the one person may give are not directly comparable to another one that another person may give. In what you might get, for example, with a survey that uses consistent wording. You can only get into so much, even in 4 hours and 22 minutes. You can only talk about so much. You're always, of course, dependent on the memory and forthrightness of the participants. And just on a technical point, the Impact Assessment Act was brought in 2019. We haven't had a lot of major projects go through it yet. So people emphasize that they were basing their comments on their experience with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act and the more recent legislation, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012. I think everybody operated on the assumption, which I shared, that there'll probably be a lot of continuity between those different statutory regimes, but there's always that qualification that we're talking about the old regime, not the new one primarily. We don't really get into this. There was an attempt to diversify the sources among seniority, national and regional losses, gender and responsibilities, just make sure we didn't get sort of a niche perspective. And of course went through the UQ research ethics process and assured everybody that activity. So finally, what did I find through this process? I have to admit this slide is a little bit of a visual pun for me because I actually got lost on this lake in a snowstorm a few years ago, and it was probably but I really wanted to be found. So my first finding, and this is sort of elementary, but it is sort of foundational to some of the other perspectives that I found. In the academic literature and the reports that we're familiar with, mitigation is actually used in two different ways. So some of the reports talk about the hierarchy is avoid, mitigate, restore on-site, and offset, in which case mitigation is only step 2 in the hierarchy. Then more commonly, and particularly in more recent publications, it's minimization is the second step. And the whole hierarchy is referred to as mitigation. So essentially minimize becomes synonymous with mitigation. And I think we can all understand that. But in some of the fundamental pieces of legislation, the Impact Assessment Act uses mitigate in this second way, and our Fisheries Act uses it this first way. And believe it or not, this has actually become a significant barrier to the two agencies work together, because when somebody else saying, oh no, offsetting is in mitigation, and it's become a real barrier to collaboration and to the development of a full federal approach. There's also a question about, is project refusal a form of mitigation? I think it is, and I put that forward to people, and some challenged me on it and said, no, you only mitigate after you approve a project. And if you don't approve it, then you don't get to mitigation. That, again, it's semantic, but it appears that it is an issue that stands in the way of progress. On the first point, these are just some of the terminology that I pulled out of other legislation or the different policy documents. Again, it's easy to see the similarities here, and these are probably synonyms, but with agencies that are trying to strictly stay within their statutory mandate and follow the wording of their enabling statutes, it becomes complicated. Second finding, and I think this one is particularly significant, is that the knowledge and application mitigation hierarchy was not equally distributed among the agencies that I talked to. There's a cluster on this side that I would say have a reasonably sophisticated understanding of it and referred to it easily, often without prompting. So that Department of Fisheries and Oceans, they have their own long-standing policy on it and a well-developed offset program. A Canadian energy regulator has been doing offsetting, particularly for caribou habitat, in a whole series of decisions since 2011. Canadian Wildlife Service is responsible again for species of risk and wetlands, and those both have emerging offset regimes and fairly sophisticated understanding of the mitigation hierarchy. Parks Canada is responsible for the administration of the national parks. Their whole mandate is around, essentially you have to get a very high barrier before they'll even consider a proposal anyway. So in their perspective on this, they take care of avoidance by excluding whole classes of projects, before they even hit the ground. On the other side though, we have the Environmental Protection and Operations Division of the Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Impact Assessment Agency. Now, the significance of that is, if we go back to this, these are the agencies that are responsible for collating and synthesizing the expert input from all the other departments and presenting it to the decision makers. So I think there's a question here that merits more investigation, and I think this will probably be the next phase of my research, is to what extent does their lack of embracing the hierarchy, there might be understanding, commitment, and there's a lot of words you can apply to that. To what extent does it become a filter between the experts and the decision makers in the federal cabinet? And I think that's really a critical question, and like I said, merits further investigation. That fundamental question, is offsetting being used properly at the end of the hierarchy? Many of the participants recognized that that was a real risk. However, a lot of them also said that what they had seen was that the prospect of offsetting more often acted as an incentive to do better mitigation. So the number that said the risk of misuse is real, 10. 2 said that they had seen cases where they were convinced that offsetting was misused. However, neither one of them would offer any details. 4 said pretty definitively, no, that doesn't happen. But then 9 said that it got around to this question that they said, well, offsetting really spurs proponents to go back and try and do more avoidance and minimization because they don't want to do offsetting. Now, it's important to note these are not distinct questions. That is, some of the people that said the risk is real may have said, but this is what they've seen. So I'd worry less about the numbers here than these are the different perspectives that I heard. When I asked them what it was about offsetting that might act as an incentive to go back and redouble on avoidance and minimization, first thing was regulatory uncertainty. This was mainly coming from proponents and environmental consultants. So basically, the situation that I've described, where you have multiple agencies with multiple policies and no coherent single approach, the proponents were saying rather than get into that discussion and try and figure out that system, they'd rather go back and try and avoid their impacts. And I'd say that so that's a beneficial result from probably not a great situation. They also reported they often have trouble finding appropriate offset sites. There's always cost considerations. And one of them made the comment that it doesn't matter how much you offset, the public will still hate you for your impact, and they won't appreciate the offset anyway. So it's a no-win situation. I think it is important here on this regulatory uncertainty. We are in Canada currently undergoing an updating of our offset policy. I'm taking some part in that. And I think there's a real caution if we we build regulatory certainty in, and it's administratively streamlined, are we going to negate this element that is actually promoting more avoidance and minimization? I think what we need to do is make sure basically offsetting shouldn't be administratively difficult, it's ecologically difficult, and that should be the deterrent. But it shouldn't be because it's a nightmare to get through the process. There was no, as I did about my first 5 interviews, I realized people were talking about the mitigation hierarchy as something sort of out there, and nobody's talking about it as part of their job. And so I started asking people, whose responsibility is it to see that the hierarchy is applied? And almost everybody said, I've never thought of that. I really don't know. And then they started offering, well, it could be the proponent, or it's the decision body, or it's us, the agency, or it's the impact practitioners, or it might be the ministers. But nobody really seemed to have a clear idea of where this doctrine that is articulated in policy is actually based and who is to be held responsible for applying. And finally, I think pretty well everybody I talked to said that the mitigation hierarchy, I shouldn't say this because some people like this, but that the consideration of hierarchy often comes too late in the process. That it's raised after all the project design features are settled on, sometimes when some of the mitigation has been finalized, and then they, at the end of the process, they'll say, and anything else should we comply with the mitigation hierarchy. There's a few aspects of the process that seem to emphasize this. One was the review of avoidance decisions is not common. It was generally left to the proponent, and some of the experts that I talked to said that they were told that they should review the project as submitted, not look at what alternatives might have been submitted, which basically means accept what the proponent is putting forward as avoidance and don't look for anything further. And as a complement to that, the alternatives analysis is prescribed by the Act, but it's given a very, very narrow scope. The Impact Assessment Agency told me that they really embraced the mitigation hierarchy. They made sure that it was mentioned in every one of their decision statements that goes to the cabinet. Now, that's at the end of the process. The very last step, it gets written up and mentioned. And there is this unfortunate tendency to leave a lot of the mitigation decisions to post-permitting that Megan has referred to as backloading. So, and one of the environmental consultants I talked to told me, well, you don't really know what the mitigations are until you've had the impact. And then when you see what the impact is, you can custom design the mitigation. And that's when you can start thinking about the hierarchy, which of course eliminates any possibility of avoidance of minimization. Now, I'm sure when she told me that she was taking for granted that there would be a lot of upfront avoidance of mitigation. That does show that there's not a clear thought process. This part of my research was funded by the Impact Assessment Agency, and they asked me to provide them with a report and my recommendations. This is what we came up with. First of all, there should be a single government-wide policy rather than these agency-specific, issue-specific policies on the mitigation hierarchy. I never thought of this before, but somebody should really be assigned. If this is going to be policy, somebody should be assigned to oversee it and be responsible for it. The mitigation hierarchy should be considered right from the early stages, not left to the end. We should minimize the postponement of mitigation decisions to post-permitting. And on a related but somewhat different note, that the more prior guidance in the forms of land use plans, best practice guidance, industry standards, and so on, more of those we can get, the easier it is to insist on avoidance in compliance with those guidelines. Because a lot of the regulators said it's very difficult to single out a particular proponent in order to insist on a performance standard. They felt that the fairness to the proponent meant that something should have been published prior to the application of the proponent. have as a reference. Also lots of thanks to Martine and Brian for their input on this. The funding from IAF was arranged through the Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada, and Justine and Ray, who also offered a lot of advice and doors for me that people to talk to. And that's about it. Thank you.
Picture. I like it, feeling lost amongst your things. Who had questions? Fascinating, the similarities, but also the differences, some of which actually make me feel slightly better about the Australians. they're not that complicated, which is one positive, I suppose.
Yes, it's kind of a general question and maybe a little outside of the scope. But yeah, thank you for this, really interesting. Is there any assessment of like the outcomes of these changes in policy that have been happening, implementing offsets? Like, are we seeing better development projects than we did like 20 years ago? I think that'd be an interesting like outcome to measure. Like, is it actually mean these companies are changing how they do development?
I haven't seen any objective assessment of that. Certainly the companies and the consultants that I talk to, and of course they've got a vested interest in investment, but they said that they had significantly improved their practices. The consultants said that proponents were much more receptive to some of the more ambitious mitigation ideas now than they have been in the past. So taking that at face value, I would say there is pressure, at least on some of the more progressive companies, to do that. Now, I'm pretty sure that it was the progressive companies and consultants that talked to me.
Yeah.
Take that with a grain of salt.
Question. And I should say for those online, please feel free to type questions in the chat. Yeah, and Michelle, share any questions.
Thanks, Dave. That was on your slide that talked about the things that actually reduced the incentives to do offsetting. I think you had like costs there, and it was regulatory lead through and stuff. Do you think that that's just in general those findings, or were they relative to the prior stages of the mitigation hierarchy? Like, were they talking about offsets are really expensive in general, or were they saying they're more expensive than rehab and minimization controls? And the same for the sort of difficulties in getting them through the system. Are offsets more tricky to get through the system than rehab? And is that just because we don't have as much sort of scrutiny of rehab in these?
Yeah, maybe I'll just go back to that. Yeah, I think with respect to these last three bullets, I think those are kind of universal. That just offsetting is difficult and costly, and how that would stack up against avoidance or minimization would depend on the particular project. I think what the opportunity cost is and the options available. The regulatory uncertainty, though, was definitely a sense that the regulators have processes to review avoidance and minimization and restoration plans. They don't know what to do with offset plans, and that it becomes a confusing and uncertain process to get into that discussion. Yeah.
Let's talk. I just wanted to ask, like, do you find any conflict of interest with the central agencies, which are supposed to overlook into the whole reporting and this thing, and then report it to the ministry, and the agencies which are experts which are providing their input to those central agencies like IAC and KEPOS, like, do you think there's a conflict of interest in terms of their background, from where they come, or something like that?
In terms of their background, not necessarily. Most of the people in those central agencies come from an impact assessment and science background. I do think that there is tension between the mandates of the different agencies, and that plays out in different ways in different situations. But there's tensions there, certainly. Yes, I think.
Questions online?
Thank you for its presentation. So is there a like practical guide available, for example, the different terminology? Like the minimize could be different from mitigate. According to my understanding, like minimize, for example, you already get a 2-lane highway, you can upgrade it to the 4-lane instead of making new highway.
Right.
But mitigation could be a wildlife crossing or flyway. So like any possible, you can collect different heads like in Canada. So what locations, so in which way you want to do the minimize, or maybe wildlife crossing is more practical, and how much it's going to incur, and what potential social risk. If someone really want the route,
Yes.
but then tell them, sorry, it's not possible, we need to avoid, but maybe you are not meet with the funding
Yeah.
requirement, you want to have policy allocation, like component there. So you always find a contraction there.
Yes, yeah, there, I mean, that's what makes the applying hierarchy so challenging, and I think why we need clearer guidance about it, but every situation will be specific, and clearly there's real social cost to avoidance, in terms of opportunity cost for economic and social projects, and it will be project specific, and there's no general rule you can apply to that, short of at least saying, look for every opportunity to avoid and really consider whether the social benefit is there.
A couple of questions from the chat. I'll race through them. First one, high Dave, great insights in your presentation I can relate to. I'm interested in your thoughts on who is best placed to lead setting up the mitigation hierarchy. In New South Wales, the Biodiversity Conservation Act defines the hierarchy. However, the decisions on how it's applied are made under the Planning Act.
I certainly won't comment on New South Wales legislation. I think ideally it should be that in our case, IAC is the central body that has its fingers into all the different aspects of the assessment process, that should be setting a standard and basically sort of exercising leadership to coordinate the effort on behalf of all the agencies that it deals with. And I don't know what the comparable situation would be. So,
I'm not sure either, but maybe, I don't know, is that John or somebody? might be able to-
It is.
Because I was just gonna say, I mean, maybe it's a question about, would you say that it needs to be the agency that is ultimately making the recommendations on decisions about projects? So
Yeah.
in this case, there's probably in New South Wales, I guess, depending on the permit, there would be different agencies or and it would be done under different acts, I suppose. I don't know New South Wales very well. So in that case, would each of them need a responsible participant in that process that is in charge of making sure the mitigation hierarchy happens?
yes, yeah,
Right.
I think that I mean, there's probably lots of reasons for preference of one position over another holding that responsibility, but I think the important thing is to pick somebody and not leave it sort of floating out there in air.
That probably answers it. If anybody else doesn't have one, I don't have one more from the chat. Vaughan Cox, thanks Dave in your travels. Have you discovered any useful frameworks, guidance, practice, etc., documents that could be a starting point for how consultants and regulators systematically address avoidance and mitigation? Need the business systems, etc., for this to happen reliably?
I can't point to a single a single example that I would say has made major progress on the issue, or could be used as a standard. I do think that this question of the incentive behind the later stages in the mitigation hierarchy is important. That if proponents are put in a position where they have to flesh out their offset plans and their reclamation, rehabilitation plans, restoration plans up front, then that may drive them to go back and see if they can minimize their residual loss more, because ultimately cost is the driver of a lot of those decisions. So, in applying the hierarchy throughout the process and not deferring a lot of those other considerations to the end, I think we sort of breathe life into the earlier stages as well and force an economic reckoning for them.
Any more questions online?
There is none. Patrick Hughes, re-offsetting as a deterrent. Are financial offsets an option for proponents in Canada?
In a very limited way. At the provincial level, there are some in lieu fee programs. There aren't any right now at the federal level, and they're probably a distant consideration right now. And frankly, I don't think the provincial ones work very well, but they are available as an option. That's another presentation. Yeah.
Yeah, so first, great talk, thank you, but you have the Fisheries Act in there, and you have DFO in there.
Yeah.
And I'm curious as to how, particularly under the Fisheries Act, because I can imagine DFO might have some things outside of fisheries that they're responsible for in terms of maybe sightings of, development plans in marine areas.
Yeah.
But the fisheries side, are they applying a mitigation hierarchy that is truncated, that doesn't include offsets? Because I'm not sure I've seen what that offset portion looks like in a Fisheries Act.
Well, first of all, the scope of DF, the Fisheries and Oceans mandate is pretty broad. So they're responsible for basically all aquatic environments and marine environments. And that goes beyond the fish. The specific offset provisions that are, if you care, section 35(2) of the Act, refer to any disturbance or harmful alteration, disturbance or destruction of fish or fish habitat. And that's, ever since 1986, there's been an offset program for essentially a replacement of fish habitat. With respect to sort of the larger questions around like marine development and so on, I don't think their offset policy specifically applies to that, and it would probably more fall into the more confusing areas of multi-agency issues. Yeah.
And so it's only applied to fisheries in the sense of other development activities affecting fish habitat, not actually to the fishery per se.
That's right. Yes, not fishing. Right. Yeah, disturbance of fish habitat. Yes.
Any other questions?
One more in the chat.
One more?
Actually, a couple more. Doesn't the BAM section 7 play a role in requiring proponents to demonstrate they have avoided or minimised impacts? That's from Paul Nelson.
BAM.
Is that, Paul, are you talking about the New South Wales? That. Probably an unfair question to ask that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Paul here. Yes, I am. I was responding to John's comment.
Oh, yeah.
Just to let people know, there's in section 7 of the New South Wales biodiversity assessment method, there's a requirement for proponents to demonstrate how they've avoided or minimised impacts, and then that has to be set out in their report. So I was interested in John's question about whether that's dealt with under the Planning Act, and I wonder whether there's a practice or implementation issue there. But in theory, at least, the proponents should be doing that via their report that's lodged as part of the DA, and then the department has a role in ensuring rigour in the work of accredited assessors applying the BAM. Anyway, it's just a observation, really.
Thanks, Paul. Until this moment, I didn't know that was possible for the voice to come through the thing. We should just do that in future. Anyway, did you want to?
No.
Good. But that's useful clarification. And was there another one?
There is another one. Savannah Wilson, great presentation. Why do you think there's confusion amongst regulators as to how they conceptualise the mitigation hierarchy? Do they not converse with one another?
Well, that's the big question, and I think some of it is this. When I started with the semantic question, that sounds trivial, but each agency is very careful to found their activities on their particular legislation. That's what they're legally required to do, and so they build their programs around those concepts that they find in their legislation. And then when it comes time to communicate externally, if other agencies are constructed in a different way around similar concepts, but not identical, there develops points of friction. And
Well, I'm sure, given that you, Dave, are involved in the new and improved Canadian offsets policy, I'm sure that'll straighten everything out.
Yeah.
So I look forward to hearing from you again, hopefully towards the end of your project with more answers and more to report. But thank you so much for that. And yeah, thanks for traveling all this way as well.